Well, good evening. Thank you for joining us for C3 this evening as we continue our journey through the Bible as part of our Bible adventure. As you're going through your readings, you're coming up now on Joshua and Judges. And again, as we're going through this Old Testament, I'm hearing from a lot of you how difficult it can be sometimes and how you're having a hard time understanding how God could be this kind of God. And hopefully we're going to help you understand that a little bit better. I am blessed for the next 2 weeks to have Dr. Jerome Creach as our guest here for C3. He is an Old Testament professor at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I had him when I was at PTS. He has been here before as a guest teacher. He is an expert in the field of the Old Testament and in violence in the Bible. And we are blessed for him to take some time out of actually his sabbatical to join us for these 2 weeks as we discuss more in-depthly the books of Joshua and Judges. So I want to just take a second and welcome Dr. Creach. Thank you for joining us. We're glad that you could be with us.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah. And before we jump in to the deeper discussion, can you tell us a little bit about your history and how you ended up at PTS and how you ended up specializing in Old Testament, maybe?
Sure. Well, the Old Testament specialization and interest goes back to my seminary days. When I went to seminary, I thought that I wanted to go on beyond that and do a PhD and end up doing what I'm doing now. And I wondered what area I would work in. I thought about systematic theology or maybe New Testament, but the Old Testament kept just calling to me. And I think the reason it did was that I found in the Old Testament the foundation of our faith, the foundation of our theology as Christians, and especially in the I'm Presbyterian. In the Reformed tradition, there's never been an understanding of this some sharp division between Old and New Testaments, and I think that's exactly right. The right way to see it. That they're both Christian scripture, both are expressions of the gospel. So I saw the Old Testament as the foundation of our theology. Then I also recognized that the New Testament was really, from start to finish, a kind of interpretation of the Old Testament. It was not rejecting it. It was, in fact, reading it as scripture and asking, now, what does that mean for us in light of this experience with Jesus? And even understanding who Jesus is, they were drawing constantly from the Old Testament and saying, this is where we see it. That's where we see it. And this is, what this means. Now, Jesus' teachings, especially Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection, we've seen this anticipated already, and patterns of God working that now we see the ultimate expression of in Jesus. So they made sense of everything from the Old Testament. So I think seeing that led me to the Old Testament. I taught for 6 years in a college in Eastern North Carolina. And then in the year 2000, got invited to join the faculty at Pittsburgh Seminary, and I've been here ever since. So it's been a great, now 20 years. It's kind of hard to believe it's been that long.
Yeah.
But it's been good. And one of the nice things, experiences, has been to get to know congregations like yours, and to be there now virtually, to talk about things like this.
Yeah. And I love that that's your background, because part of what I'm hearing as part of this Bible adventure is people are really struggling with some of the stories in the Old Testament because they feel like the God of the Old Testament is violent and angry, and the God of the New Testament isn't. And it's almost like they're separating the two. And what I'm hearing you say, and I would agree with you, it's the same God. And the New Testament is an interpretation of how the Old Testament was put together. And that's why I brought you in, because you've done extensive research on one of the things that really trip people up, which is the violence that they seem to be reading about in the Old Testament. And one of the things that I remember studying when I took your class and have read about is the ban that Moses talks about in Deuteronomy, where it basically talks about annihilation of the tribes that are in the promised land as they get what God promises them. Could you elaborate, or let's have a little discussion on how that sets the groundwork for Joshua, which is when they move into the promised land, and how we deal with that ban, so to speak?
Sure. This is one of the biggest problems, as you identify, in reading Joshua. And as you've said in our conversations, it's introduced back in Deuteronomy. And we see it in Numbers too, an example of it. The concept and the practice is something we know from outside the Bible. There were some other ancient Near Eastern people who practiced this. The most famous example is king of Moab. His name was Mesha, and he lived in the 9th century. And he went on a military campaign, and one of the groups of people he defeated was a group of Israelites. I don't know details of that, but he then erected a victory monument, a stela, that recorded all these victories. And when he described the victory over the Israelites, he said that he put them under the ban, or the way he put it is he devoted them to destruction. That's another translation of that. In other words, he gave them up sort of like a sacrifice to his God, whose name was Chemosh. And the idea, a couple of different ideas about the ban, but one of the main ones is that these ancient people, some of them seem to have, is that when you go to war and there are a group of people there and your God gives you the victory, in order to recognize that it's not your efforts, but it's this gift from God, you don't keep the spoils, you destroy it all as a kind of offering to God. And so therefore you don't touch these things, you don't possess them, that's sort of the background. And so when Moses gives instructions about the Israelites going into the promised land, he uses this language when he tells them that they should go into the land and not make covenants with the people who are there, but to put them under the ban. That's sort of what it seems that's what we see happen in the beginning of Joshua. This is what people fear, like when the spies go in chapter 2 to Jericho and they meet Rahab the harlot. She knows about them. She knows what's going to happen. And so she finds a way to trick them into preserving her family, her household, and they're spared the ban. She knows that's what they're going to do. So that's the practice. Now, you want me to go ahead and talk a little bit about how we deal with that?
Yeah, because I think some people hear total annihilation and they're like, right, how could God just be okay with wiping out an entire group of people, right, exactly, for a chosen group of people?
Right. It sounds like genocide, doesn't it?
Right.
That's the modern term that we might use to describe it. I don't think that term is accurate for a number of reasons, but I think we have to think about a couple of things here about Moses' order and about what happens in Joshua. I think we all recognize the Bible is written not as a blow-by-blow account, these stories. They're written to teach us lessons, to tell us something about how God is at work and what God expects of us. Now, two questions. Question one, did the Israelites actually practice the ban? Probably so. This is, again, practice we know from from this source outside the Old Testament. And we have one story in Numbers 21, very brief couple of verses that says they did this on one occasion, but says nothing else about it.
Right.
But the second question is, do these stories reflect actual historical reality? That is, they're not blow-by-blow accounts. So are they really telling us what the Israelites did? There's a good indication here that they don't tell us that these stories were told for some other reason. They're definitely written down much later than the events they're narrating. And one reason that I say we should probably think that the stories are not literal, I'll talk about that in a moment, is just read Joshua itself. As people, I don't know how much you're reading or where you are in the reading of Joshua,
Right.
but I invite people just to read the first 12 chapters, and you get this picture of Joshua and his army coming into the land and taking control of all of it and putting people under the ban. Now, there are actually only a couple of examples of people being put under the ban. And Rahab, and there's another group over in chapter 9 who are spared the ban. That's kind of interesting in and of itself. If you're supposed to wipe everybody out, then how can these people trick the Israelites into being preserved? Okay. But we sort of get that impression, though, chapters 1 to 12. Everybody's being wiped out. Chapter 13, though, begins, Joshua was old, all these battles are done. And then it says, and much of the land remained to be possessed. Well, how can that be if everybody's been wiped out? What's this about? So the book is more complex than we might think at first. Now, about it being literal or not literal, let's go back to Moses' orders back in Deuteronomy 7. He tells the people, when you go into the land and the Lord gives it into your hand, this is going to be God's gift to you. You're not going to really accomplish anything. When that happens, here's how you'll deal with these people. And here's where he uses the language of the ban. Have no mercy on them. Don't make covenants with them. Put them all into the ban. The word here is harem. Devote them to destruction. That seems clear. Very next verse, Moses continues and he says, now this is how you'll deal with them. Don't intermarry with them. Don't give your sons, don't take their daughters for your sons in marriage. Don't give your sons to their daughters in marriage. And goes through this detailed thing about not intermarrying. That raises the question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you slaughtered all of them, why are you worried about intermarriage?
Hard to marry somebody who's already dead, right?
One Old Testament scholar who reads this and reading it closely, kind of described, just said, corpses don't usually raise the temptation of intermarriage.
Right.
So maybe something else is going on here. The church fathers, particularly Origen, read this as a figurative statement. He said the Israelites had wars. We don't know all the details of those wars, maybe, but we know they had wars. Maybe they had to practice the ban. But this passage is not preserved as a record of that. He says, when we read, destroy all the Canaanites, what we should understand that to mean is get rid of the temptations that are within you. Get rid of all those things that prevent you from serving God completely.
Well, and that's a big piece, because that seems to be one of the major issues that the Israelites have all the way through.
Exactly. And what's really interesting in this Deuteronomy passage as well, Deuteronomy 7, when Moses gives this order, follows immediately on a chapter in which Moses has said, Deuteronomy 6:4, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. The Shema, the famous prayer that devout Jews pray every day.
Right.
Love God with your whole being. The rest of the chapter elaborates on that. And it seems that what Moses is really doing here as he continues the instruction is talking about how they will do that. And the practical outcome of if they follow his instruction is to not marry these people who are worshiping other gods. We see a hint of what this might mean for Israelites in the future when we get over to Ezra and Nehemiah. Long time after Joshua and Moses, after the Israelites have been in the land, they've lost the land when the Babylonians conquered them, and now they return to the land after the exile is over. And as they reestablish themselves, there's this recognition that our faith is nowhere close to being pure. Our worship of God is not complete. We're being led astray by the worship of other deities. And they see that happening by marrying people, Israelites marrying people who are worshiping other gods. So we have this another difficult passage in the Old Testament where there's this order to separate these people who are married to people from the surrounding cultures, people who are worshiping other gods. But that prohibition against marriage seems to be the real meaning of putting the Canaanites under the ban in Numbers, in Deuteronomy 7. The story then in Joshua is written along those same lines, it seems. The Israelites go in and they're to create this space in the land where they will live in complete compliance with God's wishes. They will be led by God. They'll establish a society that God desires. And to do that, they have to worship God completely, which means they don't interact with these people and don't let them influence them by the worship of their gods. So we have these couple of interesting stories, Rahab the harlot and the Gibeonites. Rahab in chapter 2, the Gibeonites in chapter 9. Right. Both of them seem to recognize the power and authority of Israel's God more than the Israelites do. And so they, in both cases, trick their way into the covenant, it seems. But in both cases, they remain among the Israelites, live there, and especially Rahab is remembered then as this heroic, idyllic figure who worshiped God. Jewish tradition has it that she married Joshua and that they had many children, and from them came some of the kings of Israel. Mm-hmm. Again, just legend, but it tells you how venerated a figure she was. And so this idea that they put people under the ban, even in the telling of the story, seems to be mitigated by the fact that these Canaanites that we meet are in fact not put under the ban, but remain there and live among the Israelites and become an integral part of Israelite society.
Well, and they don't necessarily even go into some of these cities with the intention of wiping them out, it seems like, on the front side. Like it's not like they go in guns a-blazing, so to speak.
Yeah. The only, with Jericho's story is the one that says they go in and Joshua gives the order again, go in and put everything under the ban. But then as soon as the story ends, we have the next chapter tells us about one of the Israelites who has kept some of these devoted things and therefore polluted. It's almost like he's created an infection then among the people, and they have to deal with that. That seems to be almost the real point of this. The other place where people are put under the ban is over in chapters 10 and 11, we meet these kings of the northern areas, and the Israelites are said to put them under the ban. But this also, in this telling of the story, sets up another great contrast. These are kings who rely on their horses and chariots. They're people who, using military might, accomplish their purposes. They're expressions of the kind of force, coercion that we've already learned from the teachings and the speeches of Moses, the Israelites are not to embrace. So they represent something among the Canaanites that God says this should not be in human society. People shouldn't rule over each other this way. And so it's really a story about the life in the land being built on something completely different. And so those are the two places, we have real accounts of the ban being enacted. And in both places, there are these nuances in the telling of the story that suggest this is not to be taken literally, or if it does report something that really happened, it's certainly not something that's meant to then lay the groundwork for action in the future.
Well, and you mentioned earlier on about how we're supposed to be able to learn some truths from these stories that can carry on. And it seems like one of the underlying truths is to not look to those other pagan religions, but to keep your focus on God. And it's sometimes easy to look back on it as you read the stories now, and you read from Joshua 3, where the Levites come up to the Jordan River at flood stage in the spring, and they have to step into the water. And once they step into the water, God parts the water. So it's like you read this story that God's doing these miraculous things. How could the Israelites see that and still be tempted by the other pagan cultures? But when you step back and look at it and are honest with yourself, how often do we see God working today and then just get tempted by something else that's going on?
Exactly. Yeah, the telling of the story seems so dramatic and so crystal clear that God acted here and there. How could they miss it? But you're exactly right. If we told our story, we might tell it in a similar way. God has acted with us. God has been faithful to us, and yet we still fail to serve God with our whole hearts. We still fail to love God completely, and we fail in that way every single day. I think that is the lesson that it's meant to teach us. And that's what the church has traditionally gotten from these stories, is that these are stories about God's grace. God acts for us. God gives us a gift we can't obtain for ourselves. And then we're to respond with love of God, serving God completely, following God's lead, living in faith. And we just always fail to do it. That's what it means for us, I think. And that's the way the church has always read it.
Yeah, and Moses, it's almost like in Deuteronomy, Moses has been like with the Israelites so long, and he doesn't get to go into the promised land, the physical promised land. And he realizes that they struggle with this, even when he was there as their leader. And now he knows they're going into the promised land where there's going to be even more temptation. And he's like, you couldn't even stay focused on God when I was here. I don't know what's going to happen when I'm gone. So here's all these things you have to kind of hold on to. And there's that covenant renewal story at the end of Deuteronomy, right before they go in, and he challenges them to live this way and have these reminders. And I think the reminders, like, remember when God did this, and remember when God did this, to try to remind them to hold on to what God has done, so when they are tempted, they don't give in to that temptation.
Yeah. I think that's really important observation you just made. The Israelites have this time in the wilderness where God provides, and they have to live by faith. And that is a time of testing and a time of preparation. And it doesn't seem to help them much when they get into the land, but that's the purpose of it. And we have, similar needs, though. We need time to be with God, for God to speak to us, to see how God acts, away from the busyness of life, to prepare us for those times when temptations come, when we're trying to figure out what does it mean to love God completely. We rely then and draw from the resources we gained, hopefully in the wilderness, in those times away. That's the pattern in these stories as it moves from wilderness to promised land. And it was in the wilderness, too, when Moses lays out this vision of what life in the land will be, which is you're wrestling with this question of violence, and rightly so. These are big challenges in these stories, but we see that the life in the land that Moses lays out in Deuteronomy is to ensure that there is equity and justice among the people there, to prevent violence in all of its forms. And it's really pretty remarkable, the vision of society that we find in those speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. We would today we might call it human rights that are established. People who are in groups that we might think of as being disadvantaged, oppressed, second-class citizens, they're given all kinds of protections and to ensure that they don't experience life like that in the land. And in that way, Deuteronomy is a pretty remarkable book.
Yeah. So I mean, that's when you put it all together, it really does tell a story and gives us some hope and gives us a place to go. And as we finish up our discussion on Joshua, before we jump into Judges, you had mentioned even that it seems like the Israelites don't necessarily get it because they still are struggling with it. And that's been the pattern since Genesis. They're blessed, they screw it up, they have repercussions for screwing it up, they cry out to God, God redeems, they celebrate, and then they repeat the process again. And that's what's going on in Joshua. And now we turn to Judges. And if there's ever a book where that pattern is repetitive, it is in the book of Judges. Well, thank you again for joining us for C3 tonight as we took a look at Joshua and what was going on throughout that book. Dr. Creach brought so much insight to that, and I can't wait to see what it will look like next week as we continue to take a look at the book of Judges. So hopefully this was helpful. Keep up with your reading, and we will either see you in person or online for worship. Have a great night.